All right, let's talk for a minute around the subject of hardware management, specifically with respect to firmware updates. I just completed an update in Waves Central, moving this from one previous version of LV1 to a new version of LV1. Again, like we talked about earlier, that's not something we do on a Sunday morning, on a Thursday night. We'll do that on a Monday or a Tuesday, probably because those are the days when we're furthest from an event and can actually get support if something goes kind of sideways or haywire. But when you perform that update, sometimes you'll need to update the firmware on the hardware, so either on your Access One machine or on your Wave server. If we're in our Setup tab, we can actually see here there's a couple indicators that have popped up. Actually, on all my hardware, I had firmware indicators illuminated, and I already did a firmware update on this piece of hardware on the SG-1000. You can see one of my stage racks has a blue firmware indicator. Blue is not critical. Blue is kind of a, hey, there's a firmware mismatch. It's not critical to system operation. However, you can see the Waves server has a red firmware indicator. That means, hey, there's actually an issue. We need to update this firmware immediately. Again, you shouldn't just open your LV1 system and find that there's firmware mismatches. This is going to be when you perform some kind of system update. To do the firmware update, very simple. All you need to do is go ahead and click on the firmware button. It pops up this little window and you click update. And then you let it do its thing. Sometimes you need to restart a particular piece of gear, so you could just pull the IEC cable out of the back, wait 5 or 10 seconds, insert it back in. Sometimes if it's deep within your rack and you can't get to the back easily, it's easier to just maybe pull the PowerCon True 1 connection out of the back and then plug it back in, just kind of bringing down that portion of the system at that point. But you might need to cycle power. So I did that earlier where I just pulled an IEC out of the back and plugged it back in, and as soon as it boots back up, comes back online. Again, blue is not critical, nice to have, and I would suggest doing those when you have a available moment. Red is system critical. So right now, my MIDI plus fit controller, this piece of hardware, the fader bank, isn't showing up in here. And there's actually nothing I can do about adding that right now because the SoundGrid server firmware mismatch is preventing me from adding it in. So that's just one example of critical operation kind of needing to be resumed. And you can see, okay, well, this is already done. So we won't go through the whole arduous process of doing all of them, but you can kind of see it says, hey, new firmware version, SoundGrid firmware update is complete. Please reboot IO box. I'll hit done. And you can see now that I've updated that firmware, now it actually is a firmware mismatch. So I'll go ahead and cycle power on that firmware, or on that stage box, and move on with the process.